In 1969, Chicago's horn section revolutionized rock music. By 1984, they were making coffee runs during their own recording sessions. Their album Chicago 17 sold 6 million copies and made $50 million. But while Peter Cetera cashed royalty checks worth millions, the horn players who built the band's sound watched helplessly as their parts were erased album by album. In 1967, 3 jazz students from DePaul University made a radical bet. They could fuse brass instruments with rock music in a way nobody had tried before. James Pankow's trombone, Lee Lochnane's trumpet, and Walter Peraziter's saxophone weren't added as an afterthought. They were the whole point. While other bands might occasionally feature a saxophone solo, Chicago built their entire identity around this horn section. Listen to how the horns drive "Make Me Smile" forward. That's not background music, not say. That's the main event. The iconic brass intro to 25 or 6/4 is as recognizable as any guitar riff from the era. When played live, audiences would erupt the moment those first horn notes hit. "We wanted to be the Beatles with horns," Pankow explained. They became something far more unique. The horn players weren't just performers, but composers and arrangers. James Pankow emerged as the horn section's primary architect, writing complex brass arrangements that sounded like a full orchestra despite being played by just 3 musicians. His trombone often functioned like another lead vocalist in the band. What made Chicago truly special was their democratic approach. This wasn't just about the music, it extended to business too. The band set up a system where songwriting credits were shared among contributors. If you helped create the song, you got credit and royalties. Revolutionary at a time when most bands had 1 or 2 songwriters who kept most of the money. This equal treatment paid off. Their first 5 studio albums all went platinum. Chicago 7 topped the Billboard charts in 1974. The formula worked perfectly, both artistically and financially. Everyone in the band was getting rich making music they loved. But as the 1970s ended, everything changed. Guitarist Terry Kath's accidental death in 1978 devastated the band. Their album sales began to slip as disco dominated the charts. Hot Streets and Chicago 13 failed commercially. By 1980, Columbia Records dropped them after years of declining sales. The band reached a breaking point. They needed a hit or faced extinction. That desperation would lead to choices that would forever alter both their sound and their bank accounts. "Your songs suck." Those 3 words from producer David Foster in 1981 marked the beginning of the end for Chicago's horn section. Foster didn't see 7 equal musicians with a unique sound. He saw one perfect tenor voice, Peter Cetera's, and a lot of instruments getting in its way. It got to the point where the rest of the band became disenchanted. James Pankow recalled in a rare 1987 interview. "The sound that put us on the map was disappearing for the sake of commercial success. Foster took over everything. I was the bass player, I was the piano player, I was the co-songwriter, the producer, the arranger," he later admitted. "I just came in like a young, arrogant barnstormer." This wasn't collaboration. It was a hostile takeover. The recording studio transformed into a corporate workplace with strict divisions. Foster isolated musicians during sessions. If the horns were playing, nobody else was there. Became standard practice. Gone were the days of the band creating magic together in the same room. For the horn players, studio days became exercises in humiliation. They'd arrive ready to contribute only to find arrangements already completed without their input. James Pankow, whose horn arrangements had defined their sound for over a decade, watched as his role was reduced to playing simple background parts, if he played at all. Chicago 16 in 1982 featured entire songs with no horn parts. Hard to Say I'm Sorry became their comeback hit with barely any brass at all. for three horn players who had built their careers on creating Chicago's signature sound. This wasn't just a creative change. It was an existential threat. Peter didn't like horns, Pankow later revealed, and he and David Foster co-wrote these big ballads. It got to the point where the rest of the band became disenchanted because it was turning into a one-sided affair. Picture this scene. The horn section sits in the studio lounge for hours while Foster and Cetera work on vocal tracks. When finally called in, they're handed simplified parts and told exactly how to play them. Their suggestions for more complex arrangements are dismissed. After recording, they discover their parts have been mixed so low they're barely audible. The creative humiliation came with a financial sting. For the first time, band members weren't equal partners in creating Chicago's sound. The horn players who had once written iconic brass lines now performed parts created by Foster. This shift would soon affect more than just their artistic pride. It would impact their bank accounts in ways they never imagined. Chicago 17 sold 6 million copies in 1984 alone. Let's do the math on what that meant financially. At a standard royalty rate of 8 cents per song per album, Peter Cetera and David Foster earned approximately $480,000 in songwriting royalties from album sales alone for You're the Inspiration. That's just one song, on one album, from one revenue stream. The financial structure was like night and day compared to our early albums, drummer Danny Seraphine later revealed. In the beginning, everybody shared. By the 80s, if you didn't write the hit songs, you were basically just getting a salary. Meanwhile, the horn players received minimal compensation for their studio contributions. While founding members still received some base salary as band members, their earnings from these hit songs were dramatically lower without writing credits. For the actual horn performances on the album, they essentially received what amounted to session musician rates, perhaps a few $1,000s total, while Cetera and Foster made hundreds of thousands from a single song. The money divide went beyond album sales. Every time Hard to Say I'm Sorry played on the radio, Cetera and Foster earned performance royalties. When You're the Inspiration appeared in a movie or TV show, they collected licensing fees. These passive income streams generated millions over time, money that bypassed the horn section entirely. This wasn't about talent or seniority, it was about songwriting credits, the true goldmine in the music business. The shift from collaborative writing to Cetera-Foster compositions meant wealth became concentrated among fewer band members. While some Chicago musicians built fortunes, others watched their financial futures evaporate. The band's publishing rights structure made this divide permanent. Publishing rights, who legally owns the songs themselves, are like winning the lottery in music. Think of it this way. Every time a song plays on the radio, appears in a movie, or gets streamed online, the songwriter gets paid. These payments continue for decades, long after the original recording session. While Lam, Lashnain, and Pankow maintained publishing for their earlier songs, the new hits that reinvigorated Chicago's career belonged primarily to Cetera and Foster. Imagine this contrast. Peter Cetera could purchase a $2.5 million mansion in Malibu from his Chicago royalties, while horn players saw their income plummet despite the band's renewed success. The bitter irony was impossible to ignore. The band's greatest commercial triumph became the horn section's financial defeat. The visual evidence was striking too. Compare the album covers. Chicago 2 from 1970 proudly features all band members equally. Chicago 17 from 1984, just Peter Cetera's face dominates. This symbolized exactly what happened financially. Collective success had been replaced by individual stardom. By 1985, when your bandmate earns millions from a song while you earn a basic salary, resentment is inevitable. The horn players who had once defined Chicago's sound now functioned essentially as employees in their own band. The silence in the studio control room was deafening. James Pankow had just suggested adding a more complex horn arrangement to Hard Habit to Break. David Foster and Peter Cetera exchanged looks before Foster responded, "We've already got the sound we want." Incidents like this happened daily during Chicago's 1980s recording sessions. The studio became a battlefield where band politics played out through musical arrangements. Horn players would arrive eager to contribute, only to discover decisions had been made without them. Pankow eventually broke his silence about Foster's approach. It's almost as if he's going, "Okay, you guys go play in traffic, and I'll make this record. I'll put as much of you guys as I need to get the Chicago sound across." The band effectively split into two camps, Cetera and his allies embracing the commercial ballad direction, versus horn players fighting for relevance. When A&R representatives visited the studio, they gravitated towards Cetera, ignoring the horn players completely. After the massive success of Hard to Say I'm Sorry, record executives made their priority clear: more Cetera-led ballads, less horn-driven material. Band meetings became ordeals where members barely made eye contact. Management often scheduled separate meetings with different factions, knowing that bringing everyone together would result in open conflict. This corporate-style divide-and-conquer approach ensured commercial decisions prevailed over preserving Chicago's original sound. Even touring emphasized these divisions. At concerts, audiences witnessed the band's identity crisis in real time. They'd play classic horn showcasing hits like "Saturday in the Park," where the brass section took center stage, followed immediately by "Hard Habit to Break," where the horn players were barely visible in the shadows of the stage, playing minimal background parts. After Cetera left for a solo career in 1985, the band reached a crossroads. Rather than return to their roots, they formalized the divisions that had been growing for years. Chicago instituted a corporate-style hierarchy. Robert Lamb, James Pankow, and Lee Loughnane became designated partners controlling the band's direction, while other members were classified as contracted players, with fewer rights. This restructuring created a permanent two-tier system within what had once been rock's most democratic band. Ironically, while this arrangement gave horn players like Pankow and Loughnane more control than during the Foster era, it officially ended the equal partnership that had defined Chicago's early years. For a band that had once shared everything from creative decisions to publishing rights, this formalized hierarchy marked the final transformation from musical collective to corporate entity. Today, you can still see Chicago touring, but their greatest commercial achievement came at a tremendous cost. Original members Robert Lamb, Lee Loughnane, and James Pankow remain, alongside newer musicians filling out the horn section. The 1980s transformation permanently altered more than just their music. While vocalists like Peter Cetera parlayed their Chicago success into lucrative solo careers, the horn players who defined the band's original sound found themselves permanently diminished, both creatively and financially. Compare the financial outcomes. Foster and Cetera have earned tens of millions from those 1980s hits through ongoing royalties, while the horn section received one-time payments despite helping build the band's reputation over decades. When Chicago was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2016, the celebration couldn't fully mask this painful financial legacy. Chicago's story reveals the cruel economics of the music business, where artistic innovation often loses to commercial calculation. Those iconic horn players who created one of rock's most distinctive sounds became background figures during the band's most profitable era. The band's artistic soul was traded for platinum success, creating millionaires and outcasts under the same band name. Next time you hear those unmistakable horns on "Saturday in the Park," remember the musicians who created that revolutionary sound, and how the industry's financial system took it all away just when they finally hit #1.